Welcome in this lecture. Today we will discuss liquidity risk. We will define what is liquidity risk, importance of liquidity risk, and how we can to measure liquidity risk for the banks. In any bank, there's assets. But generally, banks have very illiquid assets, loans, and obligation to repay their depositors in full at any time. If all depositors at bank withdraw their fund at same time, the bank will have to sell loans with discount because there is problem in liquidity, and they will not have funds to pay all their depositors. But if all their depositors keep their money in the bank, and most will be able to repay all of their depositors with interest, the liquidity position will be good. Thus, payoff to any individual depositors depends on what other depositors decide to do. If depositors repay the money in same time, the position of bank will be good to repay money for creditors. Why there is liquidity risk? In the bank, there is two sides, liability and assets. In liability side, risk when depositors or policy holders cash in claims. With low cash holding, central bank maybe face many problems to liquidate assets. How we can to convert some assets to cash? While in second side, asset side liquidity risk can result from loan commitments, liquidity requirements from take down of fund can be met by running down cash assets, by selling some assets, by convert some assets to cash, or we can depend on additional borrowing. In liability side, liquidity risk for depository institution relies on demand deposits, that's core deposits. Those deposits that provide by depository institution with a long-term funding. Now, in liability side, there's sources for the bank. Any bank need to be able to protect the distribution of net deposits trends to make any decision. Also, in liability side, liquidity risk managed by purchased liquidity management and stored liquidity management. In purchased liquidity management, central bank fund the markets and purchased agreement market. Also, by managing the liability side, preserve asset side of balance sheet. Borrowed fund likely at higher rates than interest paid on deposits. Deposits are insured but bought by fund not necessarily protected. Also, in purchase liquidity management, regulatory concerns during financial crisis, many banks faced problem in fund. Wholesale funds were difficult and sometimes impossible to obtain. While in stored liquidity management, liquidity asset to meet withdraw. In absence of reserve requirements, banks tend to hold reserve. In short liquidity management downside, this opportunity cost holding excessive cash or other liquid assets. Also in downside, that's decrease size of balance sheet, also require holding excess low return or zero return assets. That will be combined between purchased assets and stored liquidity management. In second side, asset side liquidity risk, risk from loan commitments and other credit lines. Now, any bank depends on deposits and loans, liability and assets. In asset side liquidity, the risk from loan commitments and other credit lines met either by borrowing fund and or by running down reserves. Current level of loan commitments are dangerously. Why? Commercial banks in particular have been increasing commitments over the past few years, presumably believing commitment will not be used. Investment portfolio asset side liquidity risk. Interest rate risk and market risk of the investment portfolio can cause value to fluctuate. That's arguments that technical improvements have increased liquidity in financial markets. Some argue that herd behavior may actually reduce the liquidity. And a counterpoint to proposal that technically improved could be reduced liquidity. We will observe that any reduced liquidity will be resulting from herd behavior files in the face of efficient markets hypothesis. If all markets participate desperately wish to sell, for example, then excess profit would be available to any individual who choose the run against the held and buy. In this case, the acquired outcome must be that the market price is on average correct. It's also hard to argue against the view that science any transaction has both a buyer and a seller. Now, how we can do measuring the risk? In beginning, any bank depends on many sources to fund. For that, we can say sources of liquidity, cash type assets, maximum amount of borrowed funds available, and excess cash reserves. With liquidity improvements gained by securitization and loan sales, For that, many banks have added loan assets to statements of sources. But anyway, we can say main sources for liquidity as cash type assets and maximum amount of borrowed fund available. Now we have sources for the fund. But how we can to use the fund, how we can to use the liquidity? The bank will use the liquidity or the fund to borrow it and money market fund. Also, any amount already borrowed from the central bank. Also, there are many methods or many ways to measure the risk. As peer group comparison, usual ratio include borrowed fund on total assets, also loan commitments on assets to compare between the deposits and loans. That's help us to finding the gap or the financial requirement. The financial gap depends on average loans and average deposits. We will compare between average of loans and average of deposits. The gap can be used in peer group comparison or examined for trends within individual central bank. Example, if we have an asset side loans 25 million and liquid assets 5 million, the total of assets will be 30 million. In liabilities side, we have core deposits 20 million, the total 30 million. For that, we will find financing requirement 10 million. That's financing gap plus liquid assets will equal financing requirement. 5 plus 5 will equal $10 million. Main idea in measuring liquidity risk, liquidity deficit, that gap between liquid liability and assets. Gap between liquid liabilities and assets banking firm especially likely to face a liquidity deficit because of mortgage lending, non-liquid assets, and short-term deposits, liquid liabilities, on time deposits which are sensitive to changes, on interest rate that's relative to other assets, or on risk relative to other assets. BIS approach, that's maturity ladder on scenarios assets. For each maturity, assess all cash inflow versus outflows. Also, daily and cumulative net funding requirements can be determined in this manner. For that, the managers can then evict the maturity of transactions to fill gaps. For that, must also evaluate what if scenarios in this framework. That means the bank must make plan for any scenario, depend on deposits and loans, if there's any gap. Because the gap will affect on liquidity position for the bank. So in this lecture, we explained what is liquidity risk and importance of liquidity risk and main method for measure liquidity risk as financial gap, the differences between liabilities, deposits, and loans. In next lecture, we will focus on how we can to reduce liquidity risk by make planning and evaluating for liquidity risk. Thank you for your attention and see you in next lecture.